evening. My name is Michelle Yun, and I'm Senior Curator for Asian Contemporary Art and Associate Director of the Asia Society Triennial. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Asia Society for the panel discussion, Dreaming in the Streets, the Legacy of Asian American Identity in the Wake of the Civil Rights Movement. This panel discussion is the first program in a three-part series, Harmony and Dissonance, Deconstructing Ethnicity and Agency in America. This is organized in conjunction with our inaugural Asia Society Triennial, opening to the public in just a couple of short weeks on October 27th. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Triennial, it's the first recurring initiative in the United States with a mandate to champion contemporary Asian and Asian American artists within a global context. The Triennial provides an internationally recognized platform for these artists to meaningfully engage with new audiences with whom they would otherwise not encounter, and to fully push the boundaries of their respective art practices. The inaugural exhibition, We Do Not Dream Alone, features over 40 artists and artist groups working across mediums from over 20 countries throughout Asia and the diaspora. This exciting new initiative will be on view in two parts from October 27th to January 27th, 2021, and it will be accompanied by an exhibition catalog and a robust roster of public programs. We look forward to welcoming you back to the Asia Society Museum here in New York when we reopen to celebrate this exciting initiative. And to learn more about the Triennial and how to schedule a visit, please go to our website, asiasociety.org/triennial. For our members who are tuning in this evening, we thank you for your steadfast support of our work, especially now. Your generosity nourishes our resolve to persevere despite these challenging times. And for those of you who are new to Asia Society, we encourage you to become involved. Membership details may be accessed on our website at asiasociety.org/support/membership. So the program this evening will be formatted with 45 minutes of moderated conversation, followed by about 10 minutes of questions for the panelists. And to submit a question, please send them through the comment or live chat sections of the Facebook and YouTube platforms we're broadcasting from. This program is being recorded, and the conversation will be posted on the Asia Society website, as well as our YouTube channel for further reference. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists. Alexandra Chang is Associate Professor of Practice with the Art History Program at the Department of Arts, Culture, and Media, and Interim Associate Director of the Clement A. Price Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience. She's also Associate Director of the American Studies Program at Rutgers University at Newark. Chang also organizes the Climate Working Group and the Eco Art Salon at Paul Robeson Galleries, bridging science, humanities, and the arts. She directs the Global Asia Pacific Art Exchange, the Virtual Asian American Art Museum with APA Institute at NYU, and is co-founding editor of Asian Diasporic Visual Cultures and the Americas. Chang is co-founder of the College Art Association's affiliated society, the Diasporic Asian Art Network, as well. She is the author of Envisioning Diaspora, Asian American Visual Art Collectives from Time Zone 8, and editor of Circles and Circuits, Chinese Caribbean Art by Duke Up, published by Duke Up. She's the co-editor of the forthcoming volume, Climate Advocacy, Urgency, and Context in the Arts and Humanities with Routledge. And I'd also like to note that she's a contributing writer to our upcoming Triennial catalog, and acknowledge that her excellent essay in the publication inspired the conversation for this evening. I'd next like to introduce Heidi McKinnon, who is Executive Director of Curators Without Borders, an international nonprofit organization that designs exhibitions, outreach campaigns, and educational programming for underserved communities in conjunction with museum partners, government agencies, humanitarian organizations, and NGOs. McKinnon's work focuses on historical memory, human rights, and Indigenous communities in the Americas. She brings over a decade of experience developing collaborative museum exhibitions, both independently and as a member of the curatorial teams at both the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian and the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. McKinnon was a Works Fellow at Santa Fe Art Institute in 2015. And our third panelist this evening is Helen Zia, an activist, award-winning author, and former journalist. As a second-generation Chinese American, Zia has outspokenly advocated for issues from human rights to countering hate violence and homophobia. Her published works includes Last Boat Out of Shanghai, the epic story of the Chinese who fled Mao's revolution from Ballantine Books, My Country versus Me, the first-hand account by the Los Alamos scientist who was falsely accused of being a spy, published by Hachette Books, and Asian American Dreams, the emergence of an American people from Farrar Straus and Giroux. And for those interested in delving deeper into an understanding of the Asian American experience, this last title is a must-read. Helen has been featured in PBS's 2020 docuseries Asian Americans, the Academy Award nominated documentary Who Killed Vincent Chin, and profiled in Bill Moyer's PBS series Becoming American, The Chinese Experience. Through her previous roles as executive editor of Miss Magazine and a founding board co-chair of the Women's Media Center, she has also been a great proponent of women's rights. Zia received an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters from the University of San Francisco and an honorary Doctor of Laws from the City University of New York. She's also a graduate of Princeton University. So please join me in welcoming our panelists this evening. Thank you all for taking the time to be with us. I'd like to begin the discussion by establishing a historical framework around the formalization of the term Asian American, which was coined in 1968 at the University of California, Berkeley. And so it would be great to, hear from Alex and from Helen your perspective on perhaps the context of how this came about. I mean, Asians have been living in the United States since the mid-19th century. And so, why at this particular moment was there this, this drive, I guess, to self-define as Asian American, and how that term came about? If either of you would like to start off.
Oh, Helen, feel free.
All right. Well, I think because I'm the only one on this panel who actually remembers that time. So why don't I begin by saying that it shouldn't come to anybody as a surprise, anybody at Asia Society, that in Asia, there's nobody who calls themselves Asian, right? People identify with their culture, their country, their region, and it might be their region and locality even before they name a country. And so it was in the USA with diasporic people who had come from various parts of Asia at that time, because even in 1968, there was still the effects of the exclusion period when all the ethnic cleansing took place to get rid of Asians in America. And so our numbers were small. And not only that, we had come through several wars, and were actually in 1968 embroiled in a war in Southeast Asia. So the enemy had always looked Asian. It was just kind of the flavor of the war, whether it was the Japanese who were the enemy, or Koreans, or Chinese, or Vietnamese. And for people who looked East Asian, we were all lumped together. But coming out of those different experiences, where many people were relatively new immigrants as well who had lived through World War II, there was not a natural affinity of people there was a memory of war and enemy. So up until the 1960s and the 1968, the naming of Asian Americans, you were I grew up as a Chinese American. I knew I was Chinese. I never thought about whether I had an association with Filipinos or with Japanese Americans. Actually, I didn't know any Japanese Americans or Filipinos or Korean Americans, and so forth. So really, it was the youth movements of the 1960s that included the civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement, the Asian American movement, the Puerto Rican and Chicano movements, and the gay rights movements. These were all a lot driven by young people who were baby boomers, born out of the World War II generation. And our numbers were huge. I mean, we know demographically, there were just large numbers of young people who were coming of age at that time. And like today, saw things that we felt that needed to be improved. And that included the fight for civil rights and for people to be treated in their full humanity and to imagine, speaking of dreaming and the topic of this panel, the dreaming of a world without war, without inequality, without the National Guard setting dogs upon people. And so on a practical level, it was at UC Berkeley and San Francisco State. At the time, the students, the third world students, which is how students of color describe themselves, because they were in small numbers and realized, hey, together we could really do something, forming a third world alliance. And what were the Asian students going to call themselves? Were they all going to have a separate flag for the ethnicity that they were? And it has a time and a place. There were two graduate students, Yuji Ishioka and Emma G, who said, well, on the banner that we carry, we will call ourselves Asian Americans, and that's where it began. And it really spread like wildfire because people, I was a young, then I was in high school, but just the whole idea that we could be together with other people who shared a similar experience, not the exact experience, but a similar cultural experience. And in the broader American culture, we were all lumped together. Nobody, had any idea where any of these countries in Asia were. And so it only made sense that we would be Asian Americans. And it was an empowering name, and I would dare say today remains so too. The idea that in unity, there's strength. Now, of course, there's problematic things associated with that too, because in the universal, you don't want to lose the particular characteristics or culture, but that's where it began. And it was really a name of empowerment. It was at a time when people were saying yellow power, because there was black power, there was brown power, there was red power. And so what were we? We were yellow power, because we were mostly East Asian as well. But it was a time of movement and voices being raised.
I mean, and I think it really also illustrates kind of this interest in thinking about alternate histories, or thinking about, reclaiming your own history. I mean, because that really was, in dovetailing with the development of ethnic studies departments, right? And in kind of thinking about cultural studies. And maybe Alex, you could touch upon that a little bit, about the emergence of that around this time, and kind of thinking about how, the study of, Asian American studies has kind of progressed and evolved over time, and kind of where you see that, reverberating now to the present in your own work.
Yeah, I'd like to take it kind of into the Asian American art kind of realm as well, because it's interesting to think about, because just going back a little bit, when Helen was talking about how, the groups were kind of separated, I was just thinking of artist circles earlier artist circles that, were maybe the curator at Karen Higa, late curator at Karen Higa, really studied the Tokyo photo clubs that were happening. And then also thinking about the curator Sonia Mack, who curated the sectional exhibition Round the Clock at the Vincent Pipes Museum about, this grouping of Chinese American illustrators and artists who were attached to Otis. So it's interesting to see like these different types of circles, but at the same time, I'll talk about later how, there was like intermixing really greatly beyond those circles as well. But then thinking about the Asian American terminology with Asian American art with Helen, I thought it was interesting about what you were talking about, because really the Asian American artists also from, for example, Basement Workshop in New York were producing in '72, a little bit later, this remarkable, I'd like to say the first Asian American art book, Yellow Pearl, and really thinking about what am I going to call myself, Amerasia, Asian American artist. So also taking up that terminology and being very important in thinking about solidarity and representation within the art world. So they're mirroring that. But then going back to your question about the studies, I want to also talk about Basement Workshop because, again, this will tie into probably what we'll talk about later, is that Fei Chang, of course, was the executive director of Basement Workshop. And I've done like hours of interviews with her before she passed away. But she is an incredible person. And for her, really, her background in learning about Asian American studies and building, Asian American, thinking about Asian American culture is from African American studies, African American diasporic studies, because she was saying, these are the classes that existed, and this is what spoke to me, and this is what I learned from. And so Asian American studies really goes back to African American diasporic studies. So there's that tie immediately. And then, there's the history of strikes, student strikes, right, from, San Francisco State University, really the student strikes, bringing about the ethnic studies there. And then, I worked at NYU for several years before going to Rutgers, and Jack Chen, who is now also at Rutgers, but was at NYU, really working with the students in building that Asian American Studies program there and the Institute and Studies program. And really it was the student strikes. So it came from, as Helen was saying, right, that movement of these young people coming together and realizing, that they have agency, they have power, and they want to learn about the Asian American Studies. Yeah.
I mean, and do you think, thinking about the Asian American kind of studies model looking towards the African American diasporic studies, I mean, do you think, naturally there is this affinity because both the Asian American community and the African American community are these others, marginalized others in the United States, and that, they're on these parallels, or do you think there are other more specific affinities that made that connection? I mean, and I think you touch in your essay a bit, thinking about even the interwar period in the 30s, about these kind of cross-cultural collaborations between Asia and Africa. And I wonder if there's any correlation to that as well.
Definitely. And I think Helen touched on that too, with the third world kind of studies happening at the same time, and coalition building, and really seeing that go all the way back, like even beyond the 30s, but I'm just going to start there. But like actually way earlier than that. But I'm thinking about these large circles of thinkers, artists, writers that are spanning globally, and they're tied through, for example, in researching about Chinese Caribbean art, I came across two really interesting personalities, and one was Amy Leong Pan, and one was Sybil Attic, and both of them came together at one point to start the Trinidad Artist Society. But before that, Amy Liangpan, a Chinese Caribbean artist, way back, in the 30s, like she started the independence. She was one of the founding members of the Trinidad Independence, which included thinkers like C.L.R. James was part of that kind of circle. It was just like an amazing group of people that went from the Caribbean to London, to Paris, to New York, to DC. And it was like this movement of people and ideas that were tied already back then. And they were thinking about things. I mean, I'm also bringing in kind of during that time and pushing a little bit forward, also thinking about the circles that, for example, Wilfredo Lam and Aimé Césaire, and these thinkers that are all tied together. And like, we're not realizing that, like their ideas and thoughts are moving around, and they're tied through also thinking about issues, for example, with Wilfredo Lam, specifically Aimé Césaire, Edouard Glissant. They're really thinking also about the idea, of course, with Aimé Césaire, negritude, but like the solidarity, this Pan-African solidarity movement. But then being a part of, for example, the Fifth Pan-African Congress, right? Or being part of Bandung a little bit later, in which the different countries are aligning themselves and saying, like, we're being told like we're a third world, and what is this alignment versus like the Cold War countries, but also like thinking about, as you're saying, kind of this othering, like we are tied through our othering, through so much history that ties us. So colonial history that ties us internationally. So it's coming from this really long history of interconnectedness, of thinking together, of being tied through history, and then we come to the 60s, right? And if you think about that, when we're coming towards that time period in the early 60s, we're also talking about independence globally. Of course, I'm thinking a lot through the Caribbean, but like all these movements are happening. And then we have the civil rights movement as well happening in the US. So there's like so much like that we should look at this longer history as well.
Well, and I think, yes, go ahead, Helen. I was just going to refer back to one of your points, but go ahead, please.
Oh, well, I just wanted to say, from this lens of history that Alex was, referring to, and mentioning all these writers and experiences and convergence of different movements that were going on, including cultural and historical narratives that were being written. When you are actually in history and in the moments of those times, they really don't flow together without human agency of making that happen. Sure. So these ethnic studies movements, the connection between Asian American studies and Black studies, back when Asian Americans were being named, and the third world strikes that were inspired by the Black liberation movements here in this country, these studies didn't exist. Ethnic studies, Asian American studies, reclaiming our stories were things that were fought for. Mm-hmm. So you had students fighting for the opportunity to learn and reclaim the history that we knew that, our forebears had gone through, and to find those connections. Because those didn't exist.
I think, yeah.
Asian Americans, prior to this time of great movement, a master narrative, right, and overlooked people of color, Black, red, brown, and Asian. We were completely missing. So these movements were to create that. And what happened were these students of this period were actually being researchers and historians and artists and writers to actually delve into finding these histories and finding the connectedness to Black migration stories and Asian and third world and what was going on. Because in the academy, it didn't exist. And in fact, most of the academies, and I will include institutions like museums, just did not recognize, not only didn't see that they existed, but if people wanted to talk about them, pretty much marginalized them, diminished them, and saying that they really are not even worthy of intellectual pursuit. So all of these things that Alex has talked about are things that were fought for to reclaim and to say that these are important parts of human stories.
No, I think that's a really important point. I mean, and I think to your earlier point as well, thinking about, we were talking about solidarity and coalition building, but I think there is a fine line. You made that point about kind of this pan-Asian movement, but also not distilling your own individual identity within that, too much. And I think there is probably like a chafing point, or, where you're trying to balance, coming together or, creating this movement or this narrative. But then there are so many, individual points of view or priorities. And so how can you all come together to, obviously you can't satisfy everybody, but what becomes then the consensus, I guess, is interesting. I mean, and maybe it's only in hindsight when you look back and the narrative is being cast, that it seems like it is more of a cohesive experience.
Oh, completely. When you look back from today, you're seeing the finished sausage. You did not see the sausage being made.
Yeah.
And so all of the coming together of these movements and people and ideas and if the stories are missing, what story kind of things took a great deal of struggle. And I'm delighted to know, Alex, that you in the basement workshop period, but there were running battles that went on between these different groups. Everybody did not agree. In fact, most people disagreed. And how do you come together? Well, it's through the pull and tug and the sharing and the conflict and the arguing and all of that, which was very much part of that time. And if we think about what's going on today about trying to envision, what it will look like when we make it better so we don't go to a normal that created where we are today. Well, that is going to take a lot of ideas and a lot of pulling and tugging, and that's what happened back then. It's not the finished sausage. We have to remember there was a lot that went into that.
No, I think that's a really important point to keep in mind, especially in looking at what's going on now, because I feel like there's a certain sense that, everything is, falling apart, and, that, how can there ever be consensus again, because there's such divisiveness. But I think that you raise the point that it's always been that way, right?
Right.
I mean, and I would love to also talk a little bit about, I'd love to hear Heidi's perspective, what Helen was talking about thinking about institutions and, we can talk about that in a few minutes, but when we're talking about the 60s, we're talking about these student groups, we're talking about a very elite group of communities, right? I mean, they're educated enough that they can go to school, they have the luxury of, being able to devote their time to pushing these agendas. But then maybe thinking about another touch point in the early 80s, which Helen, you were very much a part of and a trailblazer when, the Asian American community at large came together and really were championing and, raising their voice to make sure that their rights were being, acknowledged and championed. So if you could maybe speak about that moment a little bit, in Detroit, and talk a little bit about your experience of, being in the labor movement, but then also being at that moment when there was a recession and when there was very, anti-Asian sentiment, very similar to now. Maybe we can think about parallels to that, that time period as well.
Well, certainly. So out of these movements that were really part of the 1960s, that affected every community, and, speaking of students who kind of gave a name to Asian Americans and were very motivated to try to do things, to go to communities and see what we could do with this, idea, this dream of making things better and bringing our communities into the mainstream of American life and thought. That included going to learn about these movements too, knowing that we didn't really know, and what motivates change in America or in a factory or on a farm. So students followed, the international ideas, internationalist ideas that were coming from Asia, and the idea of go to the masses that came from China, came from the Chinese Revolution. Well, that was very inspiring to a lot of Asian American students at the time. And of course, we were not aware of the cultural revolution that was going on then too. But so this idea of going to the masses, I had the idea of going to Detroit. I could go, if somebody said to me, if you really want to know about social change in America, you should go to the heartland of America. And I thought that was a great idea. I was young. It was, why not? And so I picked up and moved to Detroit and didn't really know anybody there. I got a job almost right away in a car factory, which was still booming at the time, the American auto industry, and got involved in the trade union movement. But I have to say the main issues that we were fighting for were the ending apartheid in Africa and divesting companies like the ones I was working for. And so those were the kind of issues we took up. And while I was there in Detroit, the auto industry collapsed. It was another time of an oil crisis. The energy crisis led to people not being able to afford to drive cars that fell apart and got only 7 miles a gallon. And so the cars that could be driven were Japanese-made cars because they were fuel efficient and high quality. And so the broader American body politic, the politicians in Washington and everywhere else, the trade unions, the corporations, all agreed to blame Japan. It was Japan's fault that they made quality cars, and it was Japan's fault that the American auto industry and the manufacturing sector collapsed. Now, I just want to point out that Germany made very fuel efficient and high quality cars too, but racism and scapegoating only works if people look different. And so German cars and German people were not identified as the enemy, but anybody who looked Japanese was. And just to make a long story short, a period of intense anti-Japanese and anti-Asian hatred was everywhere. It just infected the airwaves everywhere. And there was talk about war and economic war. We should send the Enola Gay back to Japan, which was the plane that carried the atomic bomb. And people who were frustrated took that and translated it into personal acts of hatred and violence. And I'm sad to say that I think we're in a time like that today, except we're just at the beginning. And so a young man named Vincent Chin was killed. He was Chinese American. He was killed because he looked Japanese. It was a hate crime. And I was in Detroit at that time. I had been unemployed for quite some time and was just starting a journalist career at the time. And so I had skills of being able to write about what was going on, to communicate what was happening, and to help organize, because I had gone there to be an activist as well. But this is the part of learning about history that's so important. You know, we've gone through periods in the 1980s, like in Detroit and throughout the Midwest and actually the whole country. But we've been through that before for many, many times and many examples. And we've been through that since after 9/11 and the attacks on Arab, Muslim, and South Asian communities. And so what we also learned from that time is building on the history and shared experiences that we have to reach out to other communities, to unite with people, and to find our common understanding of making the world better without a place of violence where anybody is afraid of bringing their whole humanity into the picture. So that also happened, you know, following the Vincent Chin killing, a whole movement that not only brought together Asian Americans under this whole, you know, idea of Asians of different ethnicities joining together because it was Vincent Chin that day. It could have been anyone else. And that together we had a place of empowerment to be engaged in the civic democracy dialogue, and also to go beyond the Asian community and to join with Black, gay, Latino, you know, just really all ecumenical religious organizations, you name it. I mean, it was really people from every walk of life who had a desire to have a more just society became involved and supportive. And so that was a period of learning too for the Asian American community. And just to go back to not mythologize that, to also add that it took work. It took a lot of effort. It took a lot of deconstructing stereotypes that people had about each other, or ignorance that people had about each other, to be able to work together. But when you put in that work, that's when you actually build something, a movement that is solid and capable of really making change.
And do you think that those are sustainable over time? These kind of connections and this kind of, I mean, because people get so impassioned and in the moment, and you know, and so then once you feel like you've reached these milestones, I mean, do you think that it is fundamentally sustainable? I mean, I ask all the panelists that, I guess.
Well, I have to say, if I didn't think so, I wouldn't keep doing what I'm doing. But we can't forget. That's the thing, because, you know, we are talking about institutions. We are talking about systems of hierarchies and systemic racism, where if we get complacent and we don't remember, or we think, oh, everybody knows who Vincent Chin is. Well, of course, we know everybody doesn't. But even among Asian Americans, we know that this whole model minority idea that we are the good minority, which implicitly means that there's a bad minority, that if we absorb the toxins that are part of a larger system of culture without remembering, without learning from history, then we do risk having it forgotten. And that's why, you know, that old saying, we must learn from history if we're going to, you know, if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. It's true. So, so yes, I think it's sustainable, but we have to keep repeating the lessons that we've learned, and not think that, oh, we're in a post-civil rights society now, which was a common rubric that people said, you know, until this period that we're in. And it's obvious that no, actually, racism and civil rights are still very much an issue. So, so yes, I think it's sustainable, but we have to work at sustaining it.
And I think the point of, you know, institutions and systems being so integral to the, you know, progression, or, you know, kind of the continuation of this remembrance, or this kind of propagating work. I mean, I think then I would like to turn the conversation over to Heidi, and to think about your experience, you know, working with the Center for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage, but also for the National Museum of the American Indian, and thinking about how, you know, the Native American community has also been a historically, you know, marginalized and underrepresented community in the United States. And so kind of thinking about that parallel of, you know, you were there in the early days of the museum's founding, and thinking about, you know, how that institution was able to sit within the larger Smithsonian infrastructure, which does have a much more established and Eurocentric background to it. And kind of maybe if you could walk that through a little bit.
Absolutely. Well, I came into the Smithsonian sort of in the middle of this era of sort of new national narratives that we were trying to develop. So I kind of wanted to focus my comments there on this idea of within the museum field and in our national museum context, and sort of in tandem with and as a consequence of what was happening with this push for ethnic studies in academia. Within the museum field, and particularly at the Smithsonian, we were sort of looking at national narratives and how national narratives can sort of recontextualize the idea of you as a citizen, or, you know, citizenship building is part of what the National Museum is about. So at the time when I arrived, which was in '96, we had just, a report had just been published in 1994. There was like a task force on Latino initiatives that created this report called Willful Neglect. And it was looking at how Latinos were distributed among the staff and employees of the Smithsonian, and how they were represented in all areas of the institution. And it was pretty stark. I mean, just to give you some of the numbers, there were about 2% of staff who were Latinos. There were no Latinos who were directors or in top management or had ever been in top management. There were only 2 curators in the entire system. I worked for one of them, Olivia Cadaval, at the Center for Folklife Studies. There was another really, really prominent woman, Dr. Alicia Gonzalez, who had managed the 150th anniversary for the Smithsonian. But, you know, by and large, there was just really a dearth of representation. And so after that, the museum really wanted to expand their commitment to Latino communities. So by '97, there was a Latino center that was opened. And I started working for the Smithsonian in '96, but from New Mexico. And then in '97, I moved to DC and became part of the Latino Working Group, which was helping to support this new center within the museum. And then after that, you know, everything sort of bubbled up to the point where, I mean, to sort of make a long story short, about 25 years later, this year, we have, you know, a bill that has passed the House to try to create the new National Museum of the American Latino. So, you know, we've really come a long way. The numbers of the representation is still relatively low. I might be able to talk about some numbers later in terms of people of color across the museum field, if you want to look at that. But in parallel with what was happening with the Latino community and the Latino Museum and the Latino Center, the Asian Pacific American Center was also founded in '97. And they had sort of a different take on it. After the center was founded, then they created a report that showed very much, you know, the similar kind of statistics that the willful neglect report showed. And so at the same time that the center was opened, they started, you know, developing their programming. And there certainly was a lot of support and allyship between those 2 centers and communities of staff within the museum. And to the point that by 2013, we had our first sort of major exhibition within the Smithsonian system about the Asian Pacific story. It was called "I Want the Wide American Earth." And then the following year, there was sort of a blockbuster exhibition that was curated by a colleague of mine, Dr. Masum Momaya, which was Beyond Bollywood, and that was just a wonderful exhibition at Natural History. And by 2016, they were talking about intersectionality, and there was this great project called Crosslines, and that sort of evolved into a culture lab that the center still houses today. So those two centers that, you know, they haven't they haven't been able to open museums yet. There is a bill for the, Asian American Museum as well that's been in circulation since 2015. That might, take quite a while. I mean, each one of these bills, African American history, that bill took 15 years to get through Congress, and their trajectory was, much longer from, say, 1915. And then, by the late 80s, there was a real push to get the museum open, and Lonnie Bunch came on board in 2005, and obviously the museum opened in 2016. For American Indian, it was, sort of a different story because the museum opened in New York originally. So it was not part of the Smithsonian until 1989. So there was some legislation that was passed in 89 that Bush signed, and that brought the museum into the Smithsonian system. A new facility was opened in the Battery Park area. And then the Cultural Resources Center, which is where I worked in the curatorial department, that opened in 99. And it was an extremely diverse staff, and still is. I would say maybe at least a third of the staff was a native. And so, that just immediately changed things within the Smithsonian. And then, just the whole ethos and the worldview of that museum. There were, elements like the repatriation program that repatriated internationally that nobody else was doing, was, a little bit in contrast to what was happening at Natural History at the time. Of course, those programs have come a little bit closer over the years, but, what they were doing was really quite groundbreaking at the beginning. And so they have the programs at American Indian that, trained young curators and collection staff and what have you, have really changed the landscape of the museum field today. We have a lot more Indigenous representation. I mean, you're seeing Indigenous curators coming into the Met now. She came out of NMAI and just across the country. So this push to sort of make sure that we develop these national narratives and get these sort of stories onto the national mall, although they're happening in tandem, there was really a lot of allyship, and still is. And the more that we expand those programs, that as those new museums come on board in the next 10, 20 years, you're going to have a lot more sort of wonderful cross-pollination between the curatorial staffs, and lots of really interesting work that really will change our narrative about what it means to be a U.S. citizen. I tend not to use American because we're all Americans from Chile to Canada, but
yeah, no, I mean, I think that the point about agency and being the one having the agency to develop your own narrative, and having that cultural background makes a huge difference. And I think that leads me to my next question, thinking about the future. I mean, how do you see the way forward? I mean, Alex, maybe in thinking about academia and thinking about this younger generation and how they have become mobilized through this whole, Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, but then how, will we ever get to this kind of post moment, do you think? Or how do we kind of broaden this idea or this practice of diversity and equity and inclusion so that, we don't have to count like, oh, there were actually these many curators or academics, or, that it just becomes not even a point anymore. I mean, and I think with, the Asian American community specifically, it's the fastest growing minority community in the United States, and soon the minority community will be the majority. And so, what kind of ramifications does this have for the United States and for where we are and where we want to go? Sorry, it's kind of a big question, but do you want to start, Alex?
Sure. I was just thinking about how Helen is saying that, we always have to refresh and remember our histories, because that is so important. I always remember, with APA Institute, they had this kind of youth program, and you could be a mentor, and it was called APAYA. And there's always that moment that the student like has not heard about Asian American history, and it's the Asian American History 101 moment in which, oh my God, that happened. And I saw that happen to my family members who might be watching today, but during the Asian American documentary that happened just recently for PBS. Oh my gosh, that happened? People don't know that it happened. And like, it's so important to teach it. And so that's, I had mentioned earlier in our conversations how that I'm teaching Art History 101, and I'm very excited about that. I'm excited about that because I've thrown away the textbook that usually you would teach. And we start with actually, I started with 3 Asian American artists to start to teach. And so immediately changing the canon completely, not coming from the oral history that is usually given. So changing the way that our systems are working from the inside, because we're talking about institutions here, and really bringing what we're learning into our practice. So it is a fight too. It's not like studying Asian American art is the most difficult. Well, I won't say the most difficult. It's very difficult. You have people telling you you can't get like certain degrees, you can't study certain people because they're not white, they're not dead. They're not European. So it's not an easy thing to do, right? And then you're always pushing. And I'm lucky that I had people like Margot Machida, for example, who was before me pushing. So, it's like a constant thing, what Helen was saying. But at the same time, like, I also see that you're talking about kind of a succession type of thing, like, is this sustainable? And I want to kind of go off of the education path a little bit, just to mention, I wanted to mention the Auntie Sewing Squad, which is, I don't know if you know what they are, but there's like, I think probably more than 800 now. Like I lost count. But Christina Wong, who is a performance artist, started this sewing squad during COVID, to start making masks for people that really need the masks. And then she started recruiting people. And so it really showed you like the alternative infrastructures that were created by the arts community. Because then people like Gail Issa, who was an executive director for 25 years at the Philadelphia's Asian Arts Initiative, came on to be a care coordinator and really thinking about care, which was so important, right, to sustain the movement. And they brought on all these different artists. Badly Licked Bear came on to start really organizing for the Navajo Nation in relationship to them. So again, thinking about, who are the people that we want to reach out to? And a lot of the group were artists that were Asian American, but then it grew way beyond that. But a lot of people of color coming together, artists, and then beyond that. But it was the initial structures that are ready and the experiences that they carried over to this moment that they could use in this moment. So I just want to mention that, but I want to give time for other people.
No, thank you, Alex. Heidi, any final thoughts in terms of the way forward? I mean, thinking, I guess, specifically with institutions and structures.
Well, I feel that, and I realize that people talk about this all the time, but I don't think we're listening to youth as much as we should. I mean, if you think about where we are in terms of just the climate right now, I mean, over the next 20 years, things are going to change so much. So it's really not just our decision. I feel that we really need to bring younger voices into everything that we're doing right now. And I'd love to see that happening a lot more. Talk to your interns, give them some sort of decision power.
And the final word, Helen, there's one question, but I would love to hear any final recommendations that you have on this point.
Well, on this idea of the future, I think it really is to go back to the theme of this panel and the Triennial about dreaming. We have to dream big, and to Heidi's point about the youth, I mean, we have to give space to a whole new generation that is going to pretty much have to deal with all these, the mess that exists, and give them the space, but also give them the encouragement to know that they have the power to make change and to dream big. You have to have the dream. When, you know, when we're talking about the 60s, that was a youth movement where the generation believed we could do anything. We could end war, we could end racism, we could do all these things, have women be equal. And of course, we didn't achieve all those things. We still have these problems, but we did make progress and came through very difficult times as well. And so we're in that moment today, but you have to have the dream. You have to have the just knowing that together as a movement, these, and I would say, especially youth movements today, have the power to reshape society and to not let older generations of people like me to say that, no, you can't do that. Don't even go there. It's to have that dream to be able to do it and to learn from the past and try to avoid mistakes that have been done, but, you know, to just keep going. That's how so many of our community institutions have made it today. That's how the museum changes that Heidi talked about, or the basement workshop that Alex was talking about, or changes to institutions, you know, that's how they happened, because there was people with a vision that those changes could be made, that new institutions could be created, that new voices should be brought in. And that's what it's going to take, to not lose sight of those dreams and those visions, and keep your feet planted on the ground, but keep the vision too.
No, that's a very inspiring and optimistic. I really appreciate that. So we have one question from the audience. This question, we have time for one question. This question says that this person is curious about the East Asian centrism connected to the term Asian American, and what movements were there to be more inclusive of South or Southeast and West Asians, and was this ever seen as a problem? I don't know if any of you would like to take this question, or
Sure. I don't, you know, as a writer, I don't think Asian is East Asian centric. Mm-hmm. It's the people who carry that message, who if you look at the demographics of you know, just sort of historically, the dominant groups of Asians in America have been East Asian. I think there is a growing recognition, and this is part of the struggle and the pitfalls about pulling people together under one umbrella. But there are many Southeast Asian, South Asian, Pacific Islander, you know, West Asian voices that exist. And I would say, as an East Asian person, a Chinese American, I have to have that recognition that East Asians have been dominant, and that the word Asian really does encompass a huge continent of many, many different peoples and cultures and regions. And I'm not sure how that carries over in the museum world or the higher ed institutions, but certainly within the movements of communities, that's the word Asian American in and of itself is not exclusive.
Yes, I agree. I mean, Asia Society deals with East, South, Southeast, West, and Central Asia. So I think it is probably an associative idea that you're taking from your own experience and subjectivity, what that means. I mean, and that's also an interesting thing to consider, where your own bias is coming from, to help you kind of move forward from that. Well, thank you all again for sharing your expertise and your insights. I think that's all the time that we have for this evening, but it's been really an insightful conversation for me, and I thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.